Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Blair Forlaw, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this, the sixth and the final program in a series that's being presented by the Religious Freedom Center of the Freedom Forum. The name of our series is Religious Resolve, Stories from Our Past for Our Future. In today's program, we're going to look back into the segregation era, the Jim Crow era of the history of our country, and lift up the stories of three amazing individuals of deep religious faith who put their lives on the line in order to uphold the right of African Americans to vote. This truly is a story from our past, for our present, as well as our future. I'd like to express appreciation to the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations for their support in making this series possible. I'd also like to express appreciation to the Robert Penn Warren Center for the Humanities at Vanderbilt University for allowing us to use material from their archives this afternoon. Also, we say thank you to Reverend James Jordan and his staff at the historic Third Baptist Church of Alexandria for allowing us to use his sanctuary this afternoon. And thank you also to our valued presenters and our moderator. Our moderator this afternoon is Reverend Quadricus Bernard Driscoll. He is a pastor, policy expert, educator, and federal lobbyist. He serves as adjunct professor of legislative politics, specifically religion and politics, at the George Washington University Graduate School of Political Management. Because of his work, he lectures on the issue of religious liberty and freedom. He's an opinion contributor for the Washington, D.C. top political news site, The Hill. His work and insights have been featured in several national and international news outlets, including the New York Times, Voice of America, NBC News, MSNBC, Religion News Service, the BBC, and Showtime's documentary, The Fourth Estate. In addition, Reverend Driscoll has more than 10 years of national legislative experience in the fields of education and healthcare policy. Presently, he manages the Legislative and Political Affairs Department for a medical professional trade association. As you can probably tell, he's a really busy man, and so we appreciate your taking time this afternoon for us, Reverend Driscoll, to moderate this important discussion. I neglected to mention, but I should, he also is the pastor of the historic Beulah Baptist Church in Alexandria, Virginia. Thank you very much, and Reverend Driscoll, I'll turn the mic over to you.
Thank you so much, Blair, and thanks to the Religious Freedom Center and the Freedom Forum for this wonderful and this very last discussion of our series with regards to faith, freedom, and education. Friends, as I think about today's topic, I'm reminded of something I learned long ago as I am trained as an ethicist, and that is remembering, reliving, and retelling our story. Remembering refers to memory, the past. Retelling refers to the vision and future. And retelling our story refers to the mission. And so this afternoon, we will remember, we will retell, and we will relive our stories. The story of struggle, the story of freedom, and the story about how we ought to live authentically in a world. This afternoon, I would like to introduce our panelists. First, McArthur Myers. It is a citizen historian. He's a living legend in the city of Alexandria, Virginia, where he has been involved in lifelong initiatives to revitalize and restore the rich African-American history of the city. Born and raised during segregation, he was introduced to advocacy and politics by his mother and his second mom, both of whom were active in the struggle for civil rights. From then, he learned to step up and step in to uphold the rights of all people. Currently, Mr. Myers serves as the Grand Historian for the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Virginia. He's a member of the Alexandria Society for the Preservation of Black History, Alexandria's Black History Museum Board of Directors, Alexandria's Historical Resource Commission, and the Alexandria Remembrance Project. He has received numerous awards and recognitions and has mentored 15 young men in the city for more than 14 years, Audrey P. Davis is the director of the Alexandria Black History Museum. The museum is a part of the Office of Historic Alexandria and is one of the 8 City of Alexandria, Virginia museums. Ms. Davis has been with Historic Alexandria for over 27 years. She is past president of the Virginia Association of Museums and is one of the founders and current director of Virginia Africana Associates, Inc., the network of museums, history, and preservations professional. Ms. Davis was also an on-set historical consultant for the PBS drama series, Mercy Street. And last but not least, Reverend Rob Keithan. Reverend Rob Keithan is the minister of the social justice at All Saints Church Unitarian in Washington, D.C. He serves as a consultant specializing in counter-oppressive transformation, congregational social justice programs, and long-term cultural change related to reproductive health rights and justice. Previously, Reverend Keithan served as director of the Unitarian Universalist Association Congregation's Washington office. He lives with his wife and their daughters in Washington, D.C. I present to you the panel for such a rich discussion this afternoon.
In 1963, Reverend Joe Carter, a 55-year-old pastor and farmer, became the first African-American to successfully register to vote in his Louisiana parish in more than 60 years. The following year, he described the process he had been through in a lengthy interview with Robert Penn Warren. This afternoon, I'm going to read excerpts of his interview. I do so with the permission of the Robert Penn Warren Center of Humanities at Vanderbilt University. The full transcript is available through the center at the link we have provided in the slide. The interview began with Robert Penn Warren asking Reverend Joe Carter when and how he had gotten involved in the civil rights movement. Reverend Carter said, "Well, I met the CORE, Congress on Racial Equality, at the Reverend Anderson's church in East Valencia Parish. And I met them on a Thursday in August. It must have been at least the 5th because they explained to me concerning the registering. And I told them that I had tried and that I couldn't get my neighbors to go with me, which had been about 6 years or 7 prior. We appointed a committee for the ministers' conference to go before the register and ask him, could we register? I know that I was a citizen of the United States and not only of our own little parish. Because I was 55 years old and I had never done anything to go to jail to be disenfranchised, I could hear over the air and on television they wanted every citizen to vote. Well, they explained to me concerning the vote, which I wanted to do anyway, and I was glad to enlighten them all about how to go about it. So I made an agreement with them that I would go down and ask to register. But I did tell them that I didn't want to go by myself. I would like to have somebody to go with me. Well, at that time, there was only just me and one other, we have a little tech. Come back. Just me from West, Is that right? Well, at that time, there was only just me and from the West Valencia Parish, where we have another minister, Reverend Washington. He said, well, Reverend Davis, he wants to register. So we went on down to the registrar's office, myself and Reverend Davis. And when we go down there, we park one behind the other. Reverend Davis parked and I pulled and backed in, and why couldn't nothing get between us. So then we went into the courthouse and we didn't see nobody. We didn't hear anybody. It was just calm. Well, they didn't have any signs, you know, right or left, register's office. Well, we saw the sheriff's office, we saw the jury room, and we saw the circuit office. Quite naturally, we had to inquire where was the register's office, which was with no name on it. We walked around a little and we couldn't find the place, but we saw some laborers. And Reverend Davis asked the boys, "We're looking for the registrar's office. Can you tell us where it is?" And one of the boys said, "Over yonder." Well, we had already been over there, so that was surely false. Well, there was a white man there. We asked, "White folks, can you tell us where the registrar's office is, please?" He said, "In there." Well, it was 2 doors, but he just said, "In there." He didn't tell us no special door. So we turned around and Reverend Davis went back to the assessor's office and asked him to say, so he just say, "Up there." Well, we went on up and I said, "It must be in this hall." Well, we still didn't see nobody. Just before we got to the door, the registrars walked out of the door and pulled it behind him and stood in front of the door. Said, "Good morning, boys. What can I do for you all?" Well, we spoke to him, "Morning." So Reverend Davis said, "Well, we've come to see if we could register to vote." He said, "Well, I can't now. You got to bring something. You got to show something. You got to carry something." Well, Reverend Davis turned, he said, "Well, I really don't know what you mean by that. You tell me what you mean, probably I can produce it and what it takes." He said, "Well, you got to go back home and get 2 registered votes out of the ward where you live." Well, at that time, the high sheriff had come down the hall. So Reverend Davis said, "Well, the high sheriff knows me. And not only that, all of you knows me here." He said, "Yes, I know. They call you Rudolph Davis, but I couldn't swear to it." As I turned, he said, "Here, boy. Here, boy. Here, boy." Well, I was looking at the register, you see, and turned around and I said, "You speaking to me?" He said, "Yeah, you come here." So I turned around and went on back out to him. And when I got out, just about to where he was, he walked off down the hall back to the sheriff's office. And he had a pencil and a card in his hand. He said, "What's your name?" I said, "Reverend Joe Carter." He attempted to write, but he made one mark. He said, "What's the matter with you fellas? You're not satisfied?" I said, "Not exactly." He said, "Well, if you ain't from now on, you'll be. You hear? You hear?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Go back to where you come." I turned to go back. He said, "I ought to lock you up." Well, I didn't say anything. I just kept walking. Just before I got to the hall, he said, "I really ought to lock you up." I didn't make him any answer. Then he hollered to the deputy, "Grab him, Dan. Don't you hear him raising his voice at me? Consider you under arrest." Well, I turned my face to him, you know, and then he searched me. Started at my heels, come up and searching me. Said, "Take him out there and put handcuffs on him. Lock him up." They locked me up, put me in a car, told me, "Get in there." Well, I had pulled my hat off and laid it on top of the car. They took my hat and threw it in the back of the car where I was. And there was another white man. And when he told the deputy sheriff to grab me, they both grabbed me. So they carried me on to the jailhouse. And they got to the jail and opened the door and told me to get out. Well, I had never been to jail. I didn't know where the jailhouse door was. But I saw a hall and they said, "Go on in there." So I went on in there and the deputy sheriff asked me, "Who's been talking to you?" I said, "Nobody." He said, "You been over in Clinton and that damn nigger?" "I ain't been to no Clinton." "Who's been talking to you?" I said, "Nobody been talking to me." I said, "Don't you know we got radios and televisions? I read the papers." I said to him, "The journal said it wanted all citizens register and vote." So we're going on into the jail and they unlocked me, put me in the cell. So they went on back down the hall. They come about 10 minutes later, this young white man, he come back and unlocked the jail and told me to come out. So I come on out and they told me to go down the hall. So I went down the hall where there was a little office. they had in the jail. When I got there, Deputy Sheriff took my fingerprints first, and then he stood me over the side of the wall to take my picture. And after that, taking my picture, then put me on the scales, took my weight, took my height, and asked me how old I was. Then the high sheriff, Mr. Person, he come in the hall. He said, take his hat from him. He don't need nothing. So they took my hat. So he said, search him again. So they searched me over. Said, take all his clothes. He don't need nothing. No how. Bring the uniform out there. So they went back there and got a uniform. Then they made me pull all my clothes off. So when they was giving me the uniform, he said to the deputy, put him under that shower. Give him a shower. He's musty. He stinks. So I didn't say anything. I didn't say anything to him. So they gave me the uniform and went and started pulling off clothes. He said, who's been talking to you? I said, nobody. He said, you ain't got nothing to tell me, huh? I said, well, I ain't got nothing to tell you. So I pulled my clothes off, but they did let me keep my shoes, and I put the overalls on, and they went on in. Then later he come back, he said, you ain't got nothing to tell me? You been talking to? I said, no, I ain't been talking to nobody. Well, he told me I was lying. He walked on down the hall. Well, I stayed there, and then from that time until about 2 o'clock or 2:30, they sent me my dinner down and no spoon to eat with it. They had a spoon up in the grates up there. I don't know how long it been up there. The man brought me my dinner. He said, get that spoon up yonder and eat. So I said, I don't need it because I don't eat this. I guess they didn't expect they don't have a garbage can. Well, I stayed in that jail for about 9:30 to 2:30 without water. So after the attorney man was there from the Justice Department, and he talked with me and asked me, had I been hit or been pushed or anybody attempt to hit me, I told him the story how it happened. After this attorney left, then they sent one of them traffic cops down, and he asked me, did I have anybody I could get to go my bound? I told him, yes, well, my nephew. I would be glad for you to let him know. So he asked me, did they have a phone? I told him, no, they don't have no phone. He said, do you know anybody that have a phone that you can get in touch with? I said, well, my cousin. I said, but she's at school and could be in Baton Rouge. They brought me back to the little office where the telephone was. So I called my cousin. And he wasn't home. And I called another lady, and she gave me one of the Lodge brothers' name, Clyde Johnson, the Knights of Christians. So I called him and asked him to go get Willie to go my bond. Willie did come to my bond, but they told him his place was in an exemption, tax exemption, and they couldn't let him go my bond that day. But Willie left, and after Willie left, well, I just had to make myself satisfied, which I didn't know Willie had been there, you understand? So about 9:30 or 9:45 that night, they come back. Somebody had got money from somewhere. I don't know where they got it from, but they come in, and that night they called me about 9:45 to get up, come on and get out of there. Well, I got up, and they gave me my clothes. I pulled the cover rolls off, come back in the office, and had to sign a bond. I had to sign that I had gotten my car back with all papers, which I didn't get them all because I had a test paper there that Louis Lombard and Danny from Core had given me. You see, before I went in there to register, I let them know that I understand how to fill out the registration blank. Well, I had that put up over my sunglass of my car, but I signed a paper that I had my car back in good standing, but I was still in jail. I didn't know whether wheels was on my car, but I had to sign because they had me in jail and I couldn't get out to see the car. Well, then I get out, and before I got in my car, I put my hand up there and my papers was gone. So I didn't say anything. I just come on out. You see, by being a minister, I always carry my Bible, my psalm book, and my pastor's guide. I keep that in the car. Anytime you see the car, you see that with a coat. Care how hot it is, I always carry a coat because lots of times I be caught up the road before I have to bury some baby or something, and I keep those books with me. Well, I went in the car and they didn't take nothing but those test papers. That's all they took from me. So after I got home, well, I had a bunch of people there waiting for me. My wife said, Joe, you ought to went down there. You ought not to went down there. She said, now, if you go back down there, I'm going to leave you. I said, well, you can get your clothes and start now because I'm going back. I'm on my way back tomorrow. Well, we heard from the neighbors. They said, don't go back. Don't go back tomorrow. You let us study these things and send somebody that's rich. Well, that settled that for that time. Well, after we stayed from the 10th day of August, where they started a school, you know, training people how to fill out the papers, they started at the Pleasant Green Baptist Church. Then it had started so well that instead of doing it at the church, they would go to the Nation Hall. And they taught that school a while. Ronnie from Core asked the question, who was willing to go down to try to test the register on the 17th? Well, they had 7. And then they had 26 men there. 2 was out of Baton Rouge Parish. They were ministers, Watson and Reverend Williamson. They went in the registers of voters and the district attorney and talked with them, and then they come back. They got information on how they want him to do the crowd he had. So the district attorney told him to bring them in by 3s. Well, he come out and told us. So I was the first man who made the attempt to register. So I told them that I was going to be the first man to go back. They took us through them. Well, they had told Ronnie they had so many whites and they couldn't get to us until 2 o'clock. They told us to sit out there in the sun. About 12 o'clock, we left and walked to a little color grocery across the creek. Got us a little sandwich for lunch, and we come back for 2 o'clock. But when we got back and started going, the white citizens, they blocked that door. When we got near to them, Ronnie said, let's go back, Reverend. They're going to block the door. We turn around and leave from the courthouse step and come back to the street. Then they had a side door on the west side of the courthouse. Ronnie said, they're not on that door, over yonder. Let's go down and look. Well, we turned the corner and he went down to that door. Well, they had some new FBI or somebody to bring into the front. Well, they didn't interfere with us. And when we got to the door, we knocked on the door. He said, push the door and come in. When I got inside, they asked me what I had to identify myself. I told them I got a driver's license, a fraternity card, I have an AFL-CIO union card, and I have a preacher's pass. And I said, now, here's my driver's license. But he just looked at it and he said, sit down. And the secretary said, before you sit down, Joe, read that up there. Everybody who registered must read this. Well, that was the instructions. Answered the question in a half an hour. What the register had come back in. The first he gave me was the blanks to fill out my age and the Democratic Party. When they give it to me, I don't worry about it. I already know how to fill them out. But I looked it over and he said, you got 40 minutes. He looked at his watch and I looked at mine. I have 1 minute after 2. Well, I filled that one out and my teacher always told me that when I fill it out, before I hand it over, recheck it to see if I made a mistake. Because if I do, I couldn't, correct that mistake because if you give it, he wouldn't give it back to me. So I checked it over, I gave it to him. He said, you finished that? Well, he gave me the affidavit slip. When he gave me that affidavit slip, I looked at it and I said, don't you have another paper that goes with this? He said, yes, but I thought you was filling it out first. I said, no, I want them both. I went on and answered the 6th question. But before I returned it to him, I checked it over like my teacher told me. Well, in checking it, I did find that I did miss dotting the I's. And when I dotted the I's, I gave it to him. I said, I filled out everything all right? He looked it over, and I gave him the last paper. I looked at my watch and said, you remember I started 1 minute after 2? Well, it was 20 minutes after, and that made me 20 minutes filling this register's paper. He must have not found any mistakes on it. He just laid it over the table. Well, then I gave him the affidavit slip. He looked it over and he must have not have found anything wrong because he had laid that one down and took this one up and really inspected it good. He fooled with it from 20 minutes after 2 until 35 minutes after 2. Must have been an hour I was there. So when I come out, that man standing at the door in the hall, he asked me if I got the paper. Well, he was there with a photographer. He said, well, you did make it. Let me snap your picture. And I stood for him to snap my picture. And I don't know who he was. Now there was 1 or 2 white fellas standing there, and one of them said, get that picture because this is the last one. You'll never see him no more. You see, there were so many around me, I couldn't tell who he was because they was behind me. So the photographer said, give him a smile. Well, when I smile holding the paper, what they give me, that's all right. That's good. Good. Well, then I went back out to the outside and walked around. The interview ends when Robert Penn Warren asked Reverend Carter, was there any backlash after that? Carter replied, after that? Well, they only, called up and told us such thing as crows and black coons spitting on me and that sort of thing. Thank you. Good.
We do not know what questions the Reverend Joe Carter was required to answer in order to register to vote. But we do know that the questions you are about to see, which made up the Louisiana literacy test, were widely in use throughout the state during the 1960s. This literacy test is one of the more infamous devised by a state to prevent African American voting rights. Passing this test was based on the discretion of the registrar who administered the exam. The questions are so vague and imprecisely written that the examiner could make almost any answer correct or incorrect. The tests were used to disenfranchise African American voters and in some cases poor white voters who were in disfavor. Another crucial factor that caused many to fail this test was the time limit. You had 10 minutes to respond to 30 complicated questions, and 1 wrong answer denoted failure. The time limit could be waived for white voters. We will now scroll the Louisiana literacy test. While literacy tests were used earlier, we see them become part of the formal voter registration process between the 1890s and the 1960s. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 helped to bring an end to the use of these tests in the United States. Please remember when you vote in November that many African American men and women please remember the many African American men and women who faced violence, death, intimidation, humiliation, and fear for the right to vote. Remember their sacrifice and the right we all have to cast our vote for the candidate of our choice. It is not a right to be taken lightly. Please vote. Thank you.
Hello, can folks hear me all right? All right, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen here. Hi, so I have the pleasure of talking about two historic figures that I have a faith connection with, Reverend James or Jim Reeb and Viola Leozo. Both were born into other faith traditions, but found Unitarianism as adults, and that Unitarian Universalist faith was part of what drew them to voting rights work. Both of these folks, as you can see, born 2 years apart, 1925 and 1927, and then died 2 weeks apart. So roughly the same age, growing up in the same time. And both were remembered by their families as very strong personalities when they were young. Jim was known for being very smart and also very courteous and taking stands that were not always popular in the town of Casper, Wyoming, where he went to school. And Viola as well, even from a very young age, was boisterous and strong. She grew up in the South. And in both of these stories, before they went to Selma, they had very direct experience working with communities of color. And that when they watched Sunday, or Bloody Sunday happen in March of 1965, it wasn't just an intellectual thing for them. It was something they felt very personally. And when Dr. King issued the call for people of faith and conscience and goodwill to come to Selma, they went. So here's just a little bit of their stories. Realize I should also be timing myself. So Jim Reeb, I'm going sort of in chronological order of their deaths. So he was born in Casper, Wyoming, felt the call to ministry while working there in part with boys, disadvantaged boys, and a number of racial minorities. Went to seminary at Princeton and was a hospital chaplain for a while. And eventually came to Washington, D.C., where he served as an associate pastor at All Souls Church, where I now serve as the Minister of Social Justice. And while he was here, he focused, as he always had, on working with marginalized communities. He worked at All Souls from 1959 until 1964, when he moved to Roxbury to continue that same work. And when Dr. King issued the call, he talked about it with his wife, Marie. They had, I believe, 3 small children at the time. And then he went. And unfortunately, both of these folks literally died on the last day that they intended to be in Alabama. Jim Reeb had finished marching. He was having dinner at a local diner with 2 other ministers. And when they left the diner, they were attacked with clubs. Jim sustained a serious brain injury that he died from a few days later. And his death was very prominent. Lyndon Johnson knew about it. He introduced the Voting Rights Act just days later. Jim's attackers, unfortunately, were never brought to true justice. There's an incredible podcast actually from NPR called White Lies, which just tracks the travesty of the investigation into his murder and just how fundamentally dominated by white supremacy everything about the process was. The all-white jury, everyone in town knew exactly who had killed James Reeb. Everyone. But there was simply no way he was ever going to get justice. That podcast did identify a fourth attacker who died a few weeks after sort of being revealed. But his death really gave more national prominence. And I'll end with a little quote from Dr. King's eulogy of Reverend Reeb. But his death also had an impact in Casper, Wyoming, because him and his family were very prominent there. And so when he was injured, it was in the paper. When he dies, it's the front page of the paper. And they held a march of 250 people after his death in this little town. So there's this interesting pocket of civil rights support in the middle of Wyoming based on their personal affinity for Reverend Reeb. Shifting gears to Viola Leozo, born and raised in the South as a Catholic. She suffered a miscarriage and a stillbirth in her road to parenting, and after the second stillbirth, which happened in a vehicle on the way to the hospital, she had kind of a change of faith and felt like the Catholic doctrine that said that her unbaptized child would go to hell, basically, was not a theology that she could ascribe to. And so she was looking around for another faith tradition and eventually landed on the Unitarian Universalist faith. And at that time had moved to Detroit and was married to a very prominent Teamsters leader. So she was no stranger to controversy because her husband, Anthony Leozo, was a strong Teamster organizer, and that was not a light business to be in. And she too answered the call, and with conversations with her husband and her children about it. She had 4 children at the time. 5 children, many of whom were old enough to know the decision she was making and to be scared for her, and also to support her in following her vision, because she had always had a really strong vision. So one of her jobs related to the marches, she was trained as a nurse, so she was providing some nursing, but she also drove a car down there and was helping transport people between Selma and Montgomery. And on that, one of her final drives, African-American male was driving. She was driving, and there was African-American male there. A car full of KKK members pulled up alongside her and shot her twice. What we have come to find out later is that one of the people in the car was an FBI informant, and he is actually likely the person who pulled the trigger, and he has never been brought to justice for it. And J. Edgar Hoover was involved in the case the whole time. And so immediately after her death, the day after, the FBI already was arresting people, which was shockingly fast. They were all acquitted on murder charges. The FBI was involved in the trial, and also very actively involved in a campaign to smear her character and to paint her as someone who was there drinking and having affairs. Really just disgusting stuff. But again, we have this connection with President Johnson, that President Johnson was very involved. Shortly after her murder, he very publicly and for the first time criticized the KKK. And her attackers, who were, as I said, acquitted by another all-white jury, were brought up on federal civil rights charges. And that case is one of the very first times that a white jury convicted white defendants of a federal civil rights violation. And some people point it as both a turning point in the struggle for the Voting Rights Act, but also in how the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan, was treated, in part because Johnson was so clear on it. But that made it possible to convict Klan leaders. And one very poignant quote that I want to share, this is from her 13-year-old son being interviewed on camera shortly after her death. And he said just very clearly, she wanted equal rights for everybody, no matter what the cost was. And so even her children could understand the risk she was taking and how important that was to her values. And there's a movie about her that her kids made, and her kids didn't do so great in the aftermath, and they actually went on to sue the US government for wrongful death, and lost, unfortunately. As I said, I wanted to kind of turn around and finish with a quote from Dr. King's eulogy for Reverend Reeb. And this happened in Brown Chapel just about 4 days afterward. And in part of it, he says, naturally, we are compelled to ask the question, who killed James Reeb? The answer is simple and rather limited when we think of the who. He was murdered by a few sick, demented, and misguided men who have the strange notion that you express dissent through murder. But there's another haunting, poignant, desperate question we are forced to ask this afternoon that I asked a few days ago as we funeralized James Jackson. It is the question, what killed James Reeb? When we move from the who to the what, the blame is wide and the responsibility grows. And he goes on to talk about the systems of oppression that function in this country, and ends by saying the greatest tribute that we can pay to James Reeb is to continue the work he so nobly started but could not finish. And so my congregation, All Souls Church, has founded a project in his name dedicated to voting rights. And every year since the founding of the project in 2016, we have worked as furiously as we can to get out the vote, specifically in North Carolina, where we have historic partnerships, but also in communities in our area, in Northern Virginia, that have historically low turnout. Because for us, that is the most honorable way that we can honor James Reeb's legacy. And frankly, in the course of my research for this, I came upon articles that basically said one of the reasons we don't remember Viola Leozo is because of the smear campaign, is that her death got less coverage and less positive coverage. And so I think the lesson for me here is that because of that, and I think because of sexism generally, we have a responsibility to lift up her story more and make sure that she gets her due place in history for the sacrifice that she made as well. So thanks again for the opportunity to be with you this afternoon.
And thank you, Reverend Rob, to Brother McArthur Myers, and to Ms. Audrey Davis for excellent presentation. As I started my opening statement, I mentioned that this is the last series about remembering, retelling, and reliving our stories. And we know that remembering has some sort of ancestral knowledge that is associated with remembering the past. There's an imaginative yearning that tries to connect us to that great past. And retelling focuses on the agency that these stories have. And of course, reliving these stories focuses on the present, the now, and the action that we must take. So thank you for remembering, retelling, and reliving these important stories. And I want to remind the audience that if you have questions, please post your questions and the Q&A chat function. But while we're waiting on questions, I want to ask each of the panelists, how do these narratives, these stories you have shared with us, relate to today? Particularly as we know that voter suppression has happened and is currently happening. And I recall the quote by William Faulkner in my mind that said, the past is never really dead. In fact, not even the past. To the panelists.
Reverend Q, if I may present to the audience, today is a unique day because this is October the 18th. Actually, these dignified gentlemen and members of the parish, Felicia Parish means happy land in Spanish, and with nothing happy down in Louisiana reference to this. Now, on the seventh day, identifies October the 17th specifically because of the repercussion, that economic repercussion as well as physical danger to them. Prior to the registration, there was a young African-American kid who had said something to a white man, and they cracked his head and threw him in the river. So the community was aware of the violence. So on the 16th, that the farmers had sold their sweet potatoes to the cannery, for they wouldn't have any economic reprisal. So that's why the 17th of October of '63 was so prominent. So here we are on the 18th talking about something that happened then, and it's happening now. Now, I mean, you know, and I'll be real quick. The voter suppression used to be targeted to the African American, but as we watch as this election 2020, it's impacting everybody, all people of color, white, nationalities. So, you know, I just wanted to put that out, and as well as Brother Joseph Carter, Reverend Carter, was a member of J.C. McGee, number 54, Prince Hall Mason Lodge down in Felicia Parish. And I'll step aside and let somebody else.
Thank you, Brother Myers. Other thoughts on the panelists?
I think one of the things for me that's very important, hearing the narratives and hearing the stories of the two people who were killed, is the strength and resilience of people who want to do the right thing, who realize the importance of civic engagement and of voting. And for all of the civil rights workers and all of the African Americans who were impacted by the civil rights movement. So I think this is a lesson about how we can't take any of our rights for granted. We must do the right thing. We must vote. It's an important part to have a voice in your community and for social justice. I think of my aunt who died last year at 104, who never missed voting. Even when she was confined to that, she always voted. And I think of my parents today who are both in an assisted living facility who are very eager to vote in this election. So I think it's something we as Americans should highly prize, and something that we should actively participate in, and always think of those who've gone before us who made the ultimate sacrifice so that others could live free and have the right to vote.
Thank you, Ms. Davis. Reverend Rob, do you have any thoughts?
One of the things that is another commonality in their stories that comes through in both the White Lies podcast and the movie about Viola Leozo's life is how much many of the same sentiments of white supremacy and racism are still very, very much alive today. And in the Leozo film, they have an interview of a polling station in the year 2000. They're interviewing a white man and a younger black man at the same time. And the white man says, "I don't think she had any business being down here." And the black man says, "I think what she did was courageous." And it's like, and there you have America. Two completely different experiences that are so inseparable from racism. And so I think remembering that the struggle for voting rights is and always is a struggle, is going to be key to making sure this work does what we need it to do in the future.
Thank you, Reverend Rob. Friends, I want to remind you, should you all have questions, please use the Q&A chat feature. We have a couple more minutes for questions. I also want to remind you all that our panelists and myself have agreed to stay 15 minutes over the time for any further Q&A or even discussions that you might have. But the last question I have, as I don't see any particular questions in the chat feature, is that we know that voting that Audrey Davis spoke of is keenly vital, given all that is going on currently in our world and specifically in our country. And while I, of course, champion and will be voting next week myself, and certainly encourage others to do so, in remembering these stories and retelling these stories, and we know that, again, the reliving is the present day, which takes place now, what is it that each of us can do aside from voting, where the political engagement continues not just on November 3rd, but even after November 3rd?
Reverend Q, if I may, when I was researching and looking and reading on about Reverend Joe Carter, it reminded me of myself, everyday people, simple people doing everyday things to enhance the quality of life for everybody. And one of the things that Reverend Joe Carter said, that I'm a man now, I'm a complete person. Because voting is a dream that's followed by an action. And the action is that everybody can vote, which empowers you as an individual to affirm the only power that you really have as an input into a democracy is that one individual power. And the thing other than that, he didn't want to go into a demonstration. He didn't want to have a demonstration. He wanted to go as an individual, as a citizen of this country to lack of a better word, to do what he needed to do for himself and for his parish. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother McArthur. Other thoughts about engagement beyond voting in November 3rd?
One thing that I noticed also in reading Reverend Joe Carter's comments or his interview was that although, as McArthur Myers has emphasized, he was motivated in his own heart and conscience to do whatever it took, and it did take years. Our transcript started describing the events of 1964, but he actually had tried over a period of several years to register unsuccessfully. But did you notice how throughout the transcript that McArthur read that he mentions other ministers and not wanting to go by himself and going with minister so-and-so and parking close together and other ministers being involved in the classes at the Congress on Racial Equality to learn how to fill out the papers. And so I just say that to suggest that one thing we can do now is to try to be relationship builders, to help other people feel supported and embraced in their own efforts to do things that are really difficult. It's really difficult today to stand in line in some places for 8 hours in order to cast your vote. It's really difficult to stand up for what you believe in when everybody around you is saying different kinds of things. So I would just emphasize that it seems that those relationships are really critically important to help us all be strong, to persist in the face of obstacles that were being put down then and being put down now.
Thank you, Blair, for that. And thank you, McArthur, as well. We do have one question that I see in the chat box, which is, as we know, even in the current election, barriers to voting are still being erected, references to Georgia, etc. How can we fight these injustices in real time? Thoughts from the panelists?
Reverend Q, I will say to this. Energy is a great, great force. Individuals have to make the sacrifice for themselves. And then if you can, run for office, get on board where you can have a policy interaction with those decisions. But when it all get down to it, just know that somebody in our ancestral past had paid the ultimate price. So it's a non-compromising position. I suggest to people, go vote, but take your kid, take a neighbor, take some children, take your community with you, for you can pass this on. That's how I got involved with my mom, going around, voter registration, voter this, voter that. But too many people have died for us to just take this so cavalier.
Absolutely. Thank you, McArthur. Any closing thoughts to any of the questions from our panelists?
Sure, and I'm happy to speak to that question of how to fight injustice in real time. Kind of two things come to mind. One is that if we want things to go differently, we have to be willing to do things differently. I think if the last 50 years have told us anything, it's that things are not changing as fast as we would hope. I mean, we still have police officers murdering Black people all over America. So clearly we need to rethink some of the structures of our society in a much deeper way. And I think recognizing that work needs to be centered, not an afterthought. And it's a centering that changes how we live. And I think in some ways the coronavirus pandemic is helpful in sort of shining a lens on it of like, we shouldn't get back to normal. Normal doesn't work for most Americans. Like, we need to get back to something better. It's not, an economy that's not based on like gambling and making a small few people rich through the stock market. And kind of on the other end, I'm a big fan of Dr. David Camp's work. He is known for a White Ally Toolkit, but also does really amazing work on how to ground yourself in compassion as a way of reaching out to non-voters and to people with different ideologies than your own. And I think makes a very compelling case for why compassion is effective, and how it can be both spiritually sustainable for people, but also genuinely effective in reaching people and bridging some of the divides that we have around race and other issues. So that would be my two thoughts.
And Reverend Q, just to piggyback on what Blair was saying, one of the things for me that is most important is education. And I think if everyone who's participating in this call can educate yourself about the history of voting rights in our country, about the history of the African American struggle for civil rights. I encourage you, when we're open again at the Black History Museum, to come and visit us at the Alexandria Black History Museum to learn more of our local stories. But I also, for Alexandria, encourage everyone on this call to join the Alexandria Community Remembrance Project. While we are looking at uncovering our lynching history, we are also looking at our broader social justice mission for the city of Alexandria. And we will also be able to inform you about ways to get involved and to bring out more of not only the history, but actions that the public can take. So I encourage you to contact us at the Black History Museum or at the Alexandria Community Remembrance Project.
Thank you, Reverend Rob, and thank you, Audrey, as well. And if I could just add in and break moderator's protocol, I think the best way also is to realize that voting just doesn't stop on November 3rd. You have a responsibility to engage your lawmakers and your policymakers through town halls, through writing them regarding policies and legislation that directly impacts you and that you're interested in. So get involved. Political engagement extends well beyond November 3rd. And with that, thanks to each of the panelists for their excellent insight and their presentations. Now I will turn over to our organizer, Blair Forlaw.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this wonderful moderating this wonderful session. And this concludes not only today's program, but I'm sorry to say I'm going to miss the 6-part series, which has been full of rich discussions and a lot of learning from our past for our future. Each of you who registered today will be hearing from me again soon with a link to the recording of this program. If you would like to review it and share it with others, we encourage you to do that. Also, I'll be back in touch with some summary comments about the entire 6-part series. So please, if you will, join me in thanking our panelists and our moderator for today, for each one, the rich information and insight that they brought to the discussion. And may the stories that they lifted up for us today continue to be an inspiration to all of us as we go forward. Thank you so much. Until next time, goodbye.